I'm Kate Masters, and this is Beyond the Ballot, a series of in-depth interviews with Frederick County's elected officials. And I'm here with Kai Hagen, who was recently elected as the at-large county councilman. How are you?
One of two.
One of two.
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity and the interest.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming in.
My pleasure.
And I wanted to start because I know that you have pretty deep roots in Frederick County, but I was wondering how deep do those roots go?
Not as deep as they seem sometimes, certainly not as deep as so many of the people that I know around here, although obviously as the county's grown, there are a lot more people who have come here, or their parents came here. But my connection, though, goes back to when I was a small child, and I was growing up in Washington, D.C., but my grandparents retired to a property in the Catoctin Mountains. And my family didn't really travel much or go camping or anything like that, but we came here all the time to my grandparents' property, and I developed an attachment to that area, to the woods, that way. And but I didn't move here as a permanent resident until 1995, so it's been a little more than 23, almost 24 years now, and I guess time flies. But now my mother's here, my father, my sister, nieces, our sons, my uncle. So even though we didn't have deep roots, and it's funny, in 2006 when I was campaigning, I had only lived here for 11 years, and I would have an older woman come up to me, in Thurmont or something, hold my arm and talk to me about my grandmother, who she knew from church in Thurmont or something like that. And so in a way I felt a longer term connection to the community, but we moved here from California actually in '95.
Okay, and what prompted the move from California?
The plan was always to come back here. That's been my plan since I was in college, was to move to the same area as my grandparents' property, to live in Frederick County, and it took a while to make that happen. I went to college in Minnesota, met a woman from Minnesota, got married, and we lived in Minneapolis for 8 years, and then we moved to California for another 8 years. So it took a little while to get here, but eventually we did.
Yeah, and what were you doing in California at the time?
Well, we went there in the first place because it was part of her academic or career path. She had a 2-year residency of sorts she's a MD, MPH, medical doctor, Master of Public Health, who's got a 2-year residency with the California State Health Department in Berkeley, California. And so we went out there because of that. And I was already doing environmental work primarily in Minneapolis, and essentially spent about 7 out of the 8 years that we were in California working for a couple of different environmental organizations, California League of Conservation Voters and Forests Forever.
Okay, and what was it that drew you back to Frederick County and made you want to settle here?
Well, like I said, with my parents, we didn't travel much. We weren't a hiking, backpacking, going to parks kind of family. Growing up in the city, I wasn't exposed to a lot of nature beyond, Rock Creek Park or whatever. But when my grandparents bought the property up here, the family would come and spend a lot of time, and there were 4 of us, 4 kids, a lot of other cousins and everything that come from time to time, big family gatherings. But I would be the one kid that would disappear into the woods, literally, for hours at a time, all day, any time of year, any kind of weather, follow the tracks of a fox for miles or whatever. And I just fell in love with the woods there. And I would say it had everything to do in the end with my becoming an environmentalist, a naturalist, active on those issues, and ultimately the doorway to getting involved in politics because of that.
Sure. And you live in Thurmont now, don't you?
Well, we have a Thurmont mailing address, but we're actually 6 miles from town at 1,500 feet elevation up in the middle of the forest.
Okay.
So
that's nice. And you sort of touched on it briefly, but what was it that made you want to first enter politics and governance in Frederick County?
Well, I started doing environmental work back in 1983, or 82 really, in Minneapolis. I've worked with a lot of different organizations over the years, and when you work on those issues, whether it's Lake Superior or peregrine falcons or preserving wetlands or, well, there's a long list of issues we worked on in Minnesota. But it doesn't take that long before you realize that a lot of the issues that you really care about are deeply affected by the decisions made by elected officials. And so, who gets elected matters, and how you interact with them and can persuade or work with them makes a difference on those issues. And not everybody who does environmental work ends up moving over to the political side of it. But I had a broad range of other interests and concerns, and ultimately they connected to each other. They're all related in a way anyway. That's sort of ecological thinking, if you will. So I just started paying more attention to local elections, volunteering for campaigns, working with elected officials on specific issues from time to time, and just was just a slow, gradual process. But I never really thought I'd run for office. I had no intention of doing that. And when I moved here, I certainly had no plans to do that.
Okay. And I know that you started with the Planning Commission. Was that your first foray? Or?
No, actually, I didn't start with the Planning Commission.
Okay.
I was on the Planning Commission for 4 years, but that was during the 4 years that I was on the Board of County Commissioners. So there are 37 different boards and commissions that are associated with the county. The commissioners at the time, before we had charter government, would assign, or you would choose to the ones you wanted to serve as the liaison to, and you'd go to their meetings, participate. Some of them are like the Park and Rec Commission and others. But I'm very interested in land use and planning, development issues, and I wanted to be on the Planning Commission and the Board of Education. But in the end, David Gray and I split those. He took the Board of Education, I took the Planning Commission. I was on that for 4 years. But I started getting involved in Frederick County literally within 2 or 3 weeks after we moved here in 1995. And I was chair of the local Sierra Club for a while, ended up on appointed to the Citizen Zoning and Review Committee back in 2002, 2003. Was on the Park and Rec Commission for 4 years before I was a commissioner. I had columns in both of the local papers, Frederick News Post for a while, and the Gazette, which is no more. But so I was getting involved in a lot of different ways, and in the end, other people encouraged me to run. And actually, I said no for a really long time, but eventually changed my mind.
Okay. And back in 2006, what did you see as the biggest issues facing Frederick County?
Well, I was very involved in county issues prior to that, and land use and development are big issues. In a county that has growth pressures, in a county that is experiencing growth, how you grow, where and how, affects everything. Whether schools are adequate or overcrowded, whether you have adequate and decent parks, traffic and public transit, transportation in general, taxes, public services. I mean, the list goes on and on. So it's not as if it's just a separate issue. You have all these other issues. And then over here you've got land use and development. It affects everything. And so I got very involved in that. The board before the one I was on was a very pro-growth, developer-oriented board, and I thought that they made a series of poor decisions that encouraged sprawl, that didn't seem very responsible in terms of the provision of public services and infrastructure, the effect on the environment, didn't seem in line with the kind of community we need to be to thrive with the changes that we're seeing in demographics and markets and the kind of communities people want to live in, all that and more. So I was very involved in it, and it was through that other people, through my activity in that other people started to encourage me to run, because they were looking for good candidates to replace some of the candidates that, or the commissioners that were involved in that at the time, and some of whom were planning to run for re-election, John Lovell, Michael Cady, others, and so that's ultimately why I decided to run.
And what specifically, or what specific decisions did you see from the previous administration that really made you want to run or speak out against them?
I mean, there were a lot. There really weren't many things they did in regard to land use and planning and development and zoning that I agreed with. They were very sprawl-oriented. Now, that took some specific forms, like the comprehensive plan was broken up at that time into 5 different regions of the county. A good part of the term of the Board of County Commissioners before ours was spent on the Newmarket Region Plan. That's a large region, actually, not just Newmarket, but Green Valley and Monrovia, Lake Linganore, et cetera. And they were essentially zoning all the open space for low-density sprawl. So that was a big thing. There were plenty of other smaller issues around that related to public investments or the adequate public facilities ordinance or other things, some of the environmental concerns, the forest resource ordinance, stream buffers, a lot of things. But the Newmarket Region Plan was really the single biggest sort of long-term fight that galvanized a lot of people in regard to how they perceived that board and that set of issues.
Okay. And I know that you obviously won your election in 2006 and joined the Board of Commissioners with Jan Gardner, who's now county executive, of course. And I know that one of the things that you were able to do was to pass a new comprehensive land use plan. And could you tell me about that and sort of the process of putting that together?
Well, we had a board that, we had just, Jan and I were the 2 Democrats. There were 3 Republicans, Lenny Thompson, David Gray, and Charles Jenkins. But that was before the county politics became more partisan in its focus. And we really didn't approach the issues in a particularly partisan way. It wasn't like Jan and I were in a hopeless minority. We had every kind of vote you could imagine in terms of the combinations of people on a range of different issues. And while we had some different thoughts about what some of the best paths forward might be, we all shared different concerns related to the way in which the county was growing. And so early on, we began undertaking what was a very lengthy process to rewrite the comprehensive plan. And unlike the current livable Frederick process, that included the map, the land use designations, zoning, water and sewer, et cetera. And it took a long time. We finished it and it became law in 2010, in the last year of our term. And it included some downzoning of properties and trying to focus development smartly where our municipalities are, where infrastructure is adequate, where it's more efficient, less expensive to provide the infrastructure, in concert with other values that relates to, like the preservation of open space, coherent, contiguous areas of productive agriculture. We passed other things related to that, like the stream buffer ordinance, the forest resource ordinance, groundwater recharge area protections, a whole lot of different things that are related to land use and planning. And the comprehensive plan was sort of the bigger piece of all of that and was completed not too long before the end of our term.
Okay. And I know the term smart growth is used by a lot of people, including you. And I think that it can sometimes be ambiguous. So to you as a governing official, what does smart growth mean to you?
Well, I actually spend a lot of time trying to get people to understand smart growth. And some people have suggested to me in my campaign and at other times that I stop using the term, that because it has been either ambiguous or in some cases usurped by other people or redefined or is often oversimplified, it has come to mean just density to people. And so instead of abandoning the term, which I like because I like the approach, I've worked very hard to try to educate people about it. I've written blog entries and columns, spoken about it on the radio many times, certainly talked about it a lot during the campaign. Smart growth is really a number of different, more than a dozen distinct principles related to land use and planning and the environment and infrastructure and public services and even the public process for making these decisions. It's not just about density. It's about walkable communities and public participation and environmental protection and affordable housing and public transit and adequate infrastructure and green infrastructure, affordable, smart stormwater management, all of those things. And so trying to get people to appreciate that it is about more than just density or open space has been an ongoing goal of mine, and so I stick with it. But that's, it's really that broader list of principles that defines it for me, no one thing that I could easily encapsulate.
Okay. And in your time as commissioner, were you able to pass any other smart growth legislation?
I mean, I think we did a lot that was related to growth and to the environment. And, I mentioned some of them already: groundwater recharge protections, the best stream buffer protection in the state of Maryland, the forest resource ordinance. We changed the minimum lot size in the resource conservation zones of the county, our forested areas largely, from 5 acres to 10 acres. We changed the zoning and long-term land use designation for large areas to reduce sprawl. We looked at that in concert with everything from walkability and bicycles to public transit and other things. But there were a lot of different pieces that sort of all fit together. I mean, even down to the efforts that we made to improve the energy efficiency of the county, and other things like building the nature center in Catoctin Creek in the Middletown Valley. And you say that might not be related, but it's all part of a different vision of the community, our environment, the quality of life here, the resources that we have, and the amenities that we can provide and maintain.
Okay. And that being said, in 2010, you did lose your re-election campaign. And I was wondering if you thought that there was a reason for that.
Well, when people who win campaigns tend to think that they did everything right, and they usually didn't. And people who lose campaigns often get told they did everything wrong, or that it's one issue, and it usually isn't. This is still a plurality Republican county. When I won, there were 11,500 more Republicans than Democrats in the county, and I was still able to win, and it was a good year to run as a Democrat, even though only 2 Democrats on the 5-member board were elected. And I think so there are people who will say, well, it's because you fought against the incinerator, or people were concerned that you guys went too far on land use. And, there's a much more complicated discussion about all of those things. But ultimately, Frederick County elections happen in the national midterm election cycle. So we're affected by the national gestalt, relative turnout. If it's a good year for Republicans because you have a Democrat in the White House and there's a much higher Republican turnout, and most people who vote a straight party ticket. We have a growing number of unaffiliated voters, and you're really targeting the turnout of people in your party and the ability to generate some level of crossover support and to do well among the unaffiliated voters. And if you're a Democrat, you start behind. If it's a good year for Republicans and the turnout is much higher, you're even farther behind. And the gap that you have to make with Republicans that will vote for you, the margin you might have with unaffiliated voters, just grows. And that was the worst year to be a Democrat running in the United States, not just in Frederick County, in 100 years. It's still the largest single changeover in the Congress and things like that. That was with the Tea Party rising, the backlash to Obama, concerns about a lot of things. And no Democrats won in Frederick County in any countywide races or in any of the plurality or majority Republican counties, hardly anywhere in the country. So it was just unfortunate timing, I think, that that election happened that year. Some people will hear that and say, well, I'm not taking any responsibility for anything. I might have been able to do better or whatever. But I did the best that I could. I've always stayed really involved. That time, the timing wasn't good, or whatever else, for whatever other reasons, it didn't work out. But Unlike a lot of elected officials or candidates that fail and don't become elected officials, I didn't hesitate to stay just as involved as I'd always been. I was involved in the community working on these issues before I decided to run, when I was in office, and I've stayed involved. So for the last 8 years, I was continuing to work on a lot of those very same issues. And I didn't run 4 years ago, and after 8 years, or 7 at the time, I decided, just thought maybe this would be the right time to run and be part of the county council. It's a very different situation. Being a county council member is quite different than being a county commissioner, but it's still a real important role and an opportunity to have an impact on the things that I care about.
Right. And going back, you mentioned the solid waste incinerator, which really struck me, by how far the county got into that project before it ultimately did not come to fruition.
Right.
And for you, what changed your mind on the incinerator, and why did you decide not to continue with the plan?
Well, I mean, I never supported it. I was open to it at the very beginning when the idea came up and the county was looking at, which started even before I was elected, just before, in the last part of the term of the Board of County Commissioners before us, they were looking at a variety of different possible scenarios and approaches to deal with our solid waste issue. And so I heard about it like a lot of other people and was gathering information. But the more I learned, the more concerns I had. And my concerns grew, my knowledge grew, and my commitment to opposing it grew. I was the only county commissioner on that board who was opposed to it. It did ultimately pass, was highly controversial. I'm proud of the stand that I made, and the fact is that even when it passed, I think there was a quote in the Frederick News Post at the time that said, where I said, but I still don't believe it'll ever be built. And I'm grateful, and then some, that it didn't. And in addition to the fact that I thought it was wrong for a lot of reasons, just in the number of years since it was originally passed, we've learned enough to know that the concerns that a lot of us had about the economic modeling that was done and the range of factors that would be fluid and changeable and bore out our concerns in spades, which had ultimately everything to do with why the Carroll County Board of County Commissioners backed out of it, which broke the deal, and Frederick County would have had to start over from scratch and chose not to do that. The Carroll County Commissioners did not oppose the incinerator because they were concerned about the environment. They did it based on the economics, and we had talked a lot about that, the risk to the county, the 30-year commitment, the inflexibility, the variables that were not being adequately considered in terms of how things change. And in just a few years, they did change a lot. They made the model more clearly risky and costly, and the Carroll County Commissioners backed out of it. And so in the end, I guess I'm glad that this was a two-county partnership, because if it had been Frederick County alone, it would have been, construction would have begun, the investment would have been made, and it would have been too late by the time people realized what a mistake it was. We've been telling them all along, but not everybody was listening.
Well, and as an environmentalist, do you still think that solid waste is a problem for Frederick County?
Solid waste is a big issue everywhere. The amount of material that we generate in the first place, the nature of those materials, how we dispose of them, how much of it gets recycled, composting. I spent 4 years when I was on the Board of County Commissioners as the Commissioner's Liaison to the Solid Waste Advisory Committee. I've been working on solid waste issues going back to 1990 when I was on a committee in Alameda County, California, to write a ballot measure and then ultimately draft legislation to move them forward. They've gone from about 12 or 14% recycling to almost 80% now. And so I knew what was possible. And they took a completely different, far more flexible, far more diverse approach. Instead of the big silver bullet, so to speak, a more, flexible combination of public policies, facilities, strategies, tactics, public and private, that is far more effective and a better model for what we ought to be doing here. Jan Gardner appointed me during her first term as county executive to be on the Solid Waste Steering Committee, or the What's Next Committee. We've worked on that issue to see what we can do to take the county to the next level in terms of meeting the state mandates with the amount of waste that has to be diverted from the waste stream through recycling or reduction or composting. That work finished about a year and a half ago or something, and some efforts are being made to move some of those initiatives forward, and that's one of the things that I hope the current council will pick up and work to move forward on.
And which initiatives do you think are most promising?
Well, in the end, I mean, that was a very open-ended process in which we considered a lot of the options, but in the end, the biggest bang for the buck, the biggest step that we could make in the most certain, least expensive way to get substantially closer to the state mandates was through composting. But composting is not one thing. I mean, as people can do more composting at home, you can have curbside collection and composting. You have composting for institutions and large businesses, schools, colleges, restaurants and other businesses. And so trying to figure out, what has worked in other places, what the opportunities are, what is about the regulatory environment that we have here in Maryland and therefore in Frederick County that makes some of that more or less easy or difficult. Was all part of the process. What to do first, what to test with pilot programs. And so, we're looking at a variety of smaller scale community composting operations, a pilot project for curbside, moving forward on dealing with restaurants and large institutions that produce a substantial amount of compostable organic materials. When organics go in a landfill, they're heavy, they're wet, they get put into an anaerobic environment in a landfill and produce methane. That's a very dangerous, highly potent greenhouse gas. Our landfill and others do make efforts to capture some of that methane, convert it into energy, and reduce the amount that gets into the environment. But compost is a resource. It's a nutritional, for the environment, for farm fields, for gardens, for lawns. It's an asset if you don't put it in a landfill in the first place, and there's a market for it even. And so we looked at all of those things. You always start with any potential significant change in public policy. You always start by saying, what's happening in other places? Who's tried this or other versions of it? Are they similar to our situation? How's it worked? How much does it cost? Has it changed? Do they regret it? And there are a lot more communities doing different sorts of composting now than there were even a decade ago. So there's a lot of working models for us to be able to evaluate and learn from their experience. And so our challenge now is to figure out, which parts of that to push ahead first.
And do you think that the county will ever get to the point where we don't have to ship waste out of state?
Well, I mean, the goal right now is to dramatically reduce it as much as possible. If you look at, for example, people talk about zero waste. There's a lot of corporate policies, state and local governments that have focused on it. It doesn't actually mean absolutely zero, but it means pretty darn close, or as close as you can get. To get to zero or really close to zero, you also have to deal with the production side and some materials that perhaps shouldn't be made or sold or should be made out of different things that could be recyclable or compostable instead of not being able to, and things like that. But we know that the vast majority of our waste stream, even now, is recyclable or compostable. And to the extent to which we can divert it into more productive streams, it has a potential of a tremendous environmental benefit by not having to extract new raw materials and transport and process them and make everything out of new materials while disposing of and having other environmental impacts associated with the disposal of those materials. So it's complicated. There are changing markets for recycling, and the value of those commodities changes. There's a lot of things to take into account, but with composting, it's a mostly local thing. We're not shipping compost off to China like we were with, say, plastics or something.
Okay. And I also wanted to go back to the end of your first term as commissioner, because I know obviously we talked about the land use plan that you passed, and you're kind of a land use guy.
Yeah.
That's a big issue for you. And then I know that the next administration subsequently dismantled the plan pretty thoroughly.
Well, yes and no. The fact is, and it surprises people to know it, they didn't change a single word in the comprehensive plan. The current operating comprehensive plan for the county is the 2010 comprehensive plan that we drafted and passed after a 2.5-year very thorough process with all of the stakeholders in the community. The comprehensive plan, until this current process with Livable Frederick, includes the map, though. Ultimately, after you deal with all of those issues and gather the information and establish priorities and values and goals, in a lot of different categories that relate to your growing senior population, affordable housing. I mean, it's not just where you put things. You have to look at the map, and that map is every piece of property in the county has a land use designation, which is sort of a forward-looking projection for what the county has planned in a particular area. And much of that has specific, well, it all has some zoning categories on it. Sometimes that doesn't reflect the long-term land use designation yet because it's phased for later. It's not supposed to happen yet. What the Board of County Commissioners did with Blaine Young that came after us was to just change the map. They didn't hold to any smart growth principles or even the basic goals and values expressed in the current comprehensive plan. They essentially put it out there that they were in the business of granting zoning to anybody who'd lost it before, and a lot of other properties as well. It was a huge mistake, I think, and then they worked very hard with the Developers' Rights and Responsibilities Agreement to lock some of those in so that future boards, or in this case future county executives and county councils, would not be able to change that. They haven't all held up. It's debatable whether all of the other ones still will, but there's a substantial pipeline of houses, much of which I think represents poorly planned, ill-advised sprawl in the wrong parts of the county that Jan Gardner and the current council haven't been able to do anything about, and that we probably won't be able to either.
And is that drastic change in administration what made you get involved with Envision Frederick back in 2011?
Well, there were a lot of people in the broader community who were involved with these issues, concerned about the environment, concerned about land use and planning, good government, and didn't feel like there was an organizing entity around which they could, or through which they could focus their efforts, stay connected, stay informed, express their concerns. And so a bipartisan board of 9 people, I think it was 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 1 unaffiliated person, were the founding board members of Envision Frederick County, and I was hired to be the director. The organization continues to work. That continues to be my daytime job, if you will. We're just trying to get people more informed, more involved in the civic life of their community, and with a primary emphasis being on those elements, good government, land use, planning and development, and environmental concerns.
Okay. And you also helped found Smarter Growth Frederick, is that correct?
Envision Frederick County was the local co-founder, along with 1,000 Friends of Maryland, which was a statewide organization, and Kimberly Brandt, that founded the Smarter Growth Alliance of Frederick County. Smarter Growth Alliance of Frederick County is about 24 or slightly more organizations that are local to Frederick County and that work statewide, that meet on a regular basis, communicate substantially around these issues. And it's been a tremendously valuable way to benefit from each other's experience and expertise, to connect and communicate with other organizations and people who are working on these issues. And they continue to meet at the very least every month with good turnout, and have been very active over the last few years with the county council and the county executive in terms of some of the issues, the stream buffers and the Monocacy River Plan and Livable Frederick and some of the other things that have come up, the solar legislation and so on and on.
Okay. And I wanted to ask, one of the things that struck me when I was going through our archives in preparation for this interview was just how much you stayed involved in local politics even after you lost your re-election campaign. And I know it might sound flippant, but I mean, why? Like, why put yourself through that, and...
I mean, I don't think of it as putting myself through something. It's just who I am. I mean, since I started knocking on doors for an environmental group in Minneapolis in 1982, I've been actively involved as an employee, as a manager, as a candidate, an elected official, as a citizen, thoroughly ever since. It's just, I don't think of it as a choice that I make. It's just really who I am. I mean, I think the overarching motivation or underlying motivation comes from my concerns about the environment and the work that I did then, and getting involved through those concerns, seeing what's happening from at the local level to global issues like the diminution of biological diversity, the destruction of rainforests, the concerns about climate change, the health of our oceans, but all the way down to a local level. For years, the only bumper sticker on my car was think globally, act locally. So I pay a lot of attention to those issues. I write about them, I talk about them, but I've always focused my day-to-day professional and personal attention primarily on my local community. And when I came to Frederick County to be here for the rest of my life, didn't waste any time getting involved, and that has just meant staying involved in these issues, whether you've got an elected official or elected officials who are sympathetic and share some of those concerns and values, or you don't, you stay at it.
And now that you've been reelected to county council, do you plan to stay involved with Envision Frederick? And
yeah, it's still my day job. I mean, it's a 501c3 organization. It's not a lobbying organization. And during the campaign, we went to the greatest extent possible to keep my campaign and that work completely separate. And we'll do that now. Envision won't be lobbying the county council that I'm on or the county executive about issues, but we'll be working through the speaker series and the outings and the seminars and the green drinks and the other things that we co-sponsor and other things to work to get people more informed and involved about smart growth, about affordable housing, about green infrastructure, about public transit, about energy use and regenerative agriculture and climate change's effects locally. Because there's things we can do to mitigate our contribution to that problem, but there are also things we need to do to anticipate changes that are going to be happening, and our ability to be resilient in the face of those changes is something that will benefit from anticipating them and planning accordingly.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you think, that years of work that you've put in with Envision and Smarter Growth might at least send the appearance or make you less receptive to people who are very pro-development or very pro-property rights in the county.
I mean, you're going to agree and disagree with all sorts of people about all sorts of things. I mean, I've always worked with people who don't share all of my goals and values, or hardly any of them. And when you get elected or run to be on a council, you don't know who's going to be elected. You work with what you end up with, the people that you have, the circumstances that you have, the issues that your community is facing, and you do the best job you can. And that means working in a civil, collegial way. If you want to be effective, it's about trying to help people understand your point of view, understand your way of thinking, sharing, your values, and how that manifests itself in the individual choices that we make as a community. A lot of these things are common sense, and a lot of them are not so obvious. But there's information out there to defend or use to try to persuade people to a particular approach or point of view, and maybe they come a little ways, maybe they come a long ways, maybe they don't at all. It's going to vary from issue to issue, but it's just a different place to be in working to have an impact on those things. And I meet with and work with people in the development community, affordable housing community, we have a broad range of views and opinions in this community, and part of what you have to do in government is figure out how to use a good public process to gather as much information as you can, to engage the stakeholders, to make your case as well as you can, evaluate your options, and make good decisions. And the environment in which you're doing that is created by all the other people who are involved.
And realistically, what do you hope to accomplish first now that you're back on the council?
Well, I mean, I think it's a 7-member council, and we're just a legislative branch, and the county executive, has a great deal of influence over those things as well. But I think initially, while we're all going to have our particular issues that we're more or less concerned about, part of our early agenda is going to be decided by the things that have already been happening. So, for example, for the last few years, the county has been very involved in the Livable Frederick process. It's been a 3-year plus process of creating a new sort of comprehensive plan for the county. That's not finished. So that's on the agenda, right? To finish that the public hearings, the remaining discussions with the Planning Commission, among the county council members, with the county executive, staff, and the public. And then once that's done, you have to work to implement actual public policy to reflect those goals. And so the Solid Waste Steering Committee did all of its work and has things ahead to focus on to try to make some of that happen. The Monocacy Scenic River Management Plan has been a controversial, recent, ongoing issue that is still unresolved. We're jumping right into the budget process, and now that's a very different process now because when I was a commissioner, we were the executive and the legislative branch and responsible for every line in the budget, and now the budget is presented to the council from the county executive, and we can discuss it, reduce some things. One of the things I might like to see changed is to increase the role and authority to some moderate, reasonable degree of the council in the budget process. But it's a different process than it used to be, but that starts now, next year's budget. So there's a lot of things that are, dealing with continuing the work to try to catch up with new schools, renovated schools. There's some public safety issues and catch up that we need to make around that with firefighters and others. So there's no shortage of things that we're going to kind of just pick up and have to kind of organize into our agenda and prioritize, and some of that's already dictated. And then somewhere along the line, as you're working your way into and through that, you'll have the discussions about the specific goals and projects that individual council members would like to take on. And I've certainly got some concerns and ideas about that.
Sure. And I know the Monocacy Scenic River Plan is very much in your wheelhouse. And so right now, do you support the plan as it's written?
No. I think that there are things, if you could go back and redo the process, that they could have done differently or better. But I think that the plan, after it was originally put out to public comment and review and more adjustments, that made some initial adjustments in the face of the public feedback and concerns that some people had around property rights and some of the sort of abstract lines that were drawn and things like that. I think after that point, it got to what I considered a really good space. I mean, look, this is an advisory document. It's not legislation that creates specific actions. It's by an advisory board. And ultimately what comes of it will happen because elected officials decide to take on one thing or another to move forward towards those goals in response to the concerns that are identified about the quality of the habitat, the long-term protection of the corridor, the water quality, which many people rely on as drinking water, and things like that. So a big part of the plan was to be an excellent report, a look at the history, a look at the impacts, a look at the water quality. And there are certain things that maybe we could add to it, in fact, in terms of scientific information, baseline data, other things like that to make it even better. But at no point has it been something that had that included anything other than recommendations. And in the end, that's what it does. It's an advisory document from an advisory board that makes recommendations based on all of this process, looking at the information that's available about the challenges and threats and concerns and possibilities and opportunities that exist related to the river and its corridor. So I think that there's been a lot of fear-mongering about the plan, a lot of accusations about incursions on property rights that just really aren't there. If you look at the actual plan, the recommendations are voluntary. There are things like saying, you know, if we have money invested in planting trees, let's prioritize some of those resources to this corridor so that that's just one of many pages of examples, but that's the form that it takes. It's entirely voluntary. But ultimately, what I would say is that in some respects, it's a mistake to think of it as a corridor to be focused on. Most of the water that flows into the river doesn't land in or flow from that narrow corridor. It comes from the watershed of the entire river system and all of the sub-watersheds and, you know, sub-watersheds of those, the smaller creeks and streams and tributaries that run from the top of the Catoctin Mountains to Pennsylvania, Carroll County, and through farmland, towns, forests. And if we're going to be long-term responsible about protecting our green infrastructure, about maintaining biological diversity as we add people and development, about protecting the quality of the water for that habitat and for human consumption, we're going to have to think about the whole watershed. And in a way that reflects an understanding that there's going to be some growth and development, and there's going to be activities like farming and other things. And how can we do that in a way that protects those streams, that habitat, that water quality better? That's really the issue. And any legislation that I would propose or want to support to move forward based on the recommendations and the information in the plan would be with those goals in mind.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned even adding scientific language to the plan, but do you think that's even feasible now? Because it's become such a partisan issue. And I think that there are some people who would argue, well, it doesn't matter what scientific language is in the plan. We just don't want to have to plant trees on our property if we don't want to plant trees.
Nobody has to. I mean, there's nothing in the plan that requires anybody to plant anything. So, you know, but there has been a lot of misinformation. There has been some organizing that's been based on fear-mongering. But I think most of the people in the county, when they understand the issue, support the idea of taking reasonable steps and voluntary actions and creating the proper incentives and managing things smartly to preserve the biological integrity of the river system and the quality of the water. And it's our job in part to figure out how to balance competing priorities, different perceptions, different issues, property rights and everything else in a way that works for the broader community and makes sense. And I think we can do that without any incursions on private property rights. People have been talking about, you know, there was a lot of stuff about the county's going to take your property and create public access and bike paths along the river. None of that is planned. I was on the Park and Rec Commission for 8 years. I know none of that is planned. But that didn't stop people from fear-mongering about it, coming and testifying against it, something that wasn't even there. So, I mean, you know, we've focused in this conversation, I imagine we're getting close to running out of time, on a lot of land use and some environmental issues. And, you know, if we get another chance some other time, it'd be nice to talk about some of the other concerns in the community that I think are really important that my campaign tried to focus on as well, like, you know, affordable housing and other things, because people do have the sense of me that is not entirely unfair of being very heavily focused on land use and environmental issues, but I've been very involved in, you know, affordable housing issues, agricultural development, a lot of other things that are going to be facing the county with choices that we have to make in the near future.
Sure. And I also wanted to give people a chance to get to know you a little bit more beyond politics. And I was wondering if you could just talk about your family a little bit, just to start.
Well, I grew up in Washington, D.C., but I went to college in Minnesota. Actually, St. Olaf College in the town I was born in during my parents' senior year while they were attending St. Olaf College. And I met my wife there. We were married the summer after college. We've been married 38 years and a few months.
Wow.
Yeah, that's when you're supposed to say, I don't look old enough to be married. Married for 38 years. But yeah, it's a long time. We were married in Washington, D.C. actually, but then lived for 8 years in Minnesota, moved to California in 1991. Our first son was born, so not until we'd been married for a little more than 11 years. And we were there for another 3.5 years. That's how old he was when we moved to Frederick in 1995. So he basically, his name's Tor. He's just turned 27
Tor.
a few days ago, and he grew up in Frederick County, and then our second son was born here in 1995, and they both went to school in Frederick, graduated from TJ High School. Tor went off to college at Carleton College in Minnesota also, and Leif is a senior right now at University of Maryland in computer sciences. We lived in Frederick for a number of years in a townhouse not far from the Freeze King, which is no longer there. But it was nice having it with kids and a short walk across the park. And then we moved in in August of 2000 up to the property in the mountains and have lived in the forest since then.
Okay. And how did you and your wife meet?
We actually lived in the same freshman dorm.
Okay.
There is a very funny story about how we actually started dating, but I will not tell you that story right now.
No, you have to.
There's not a short version. It's to get the whole thing. I don't think we have four minutes or so to talk about it. But we started dating halfway through our junior year, and got married this summer after college.
You can't tell me the story at all.
There's not really a good short version of it, so some other time.
And I also wanted to ask, so your first son's name is Tor.
T-O-R.
T-O-R. Where does that come from?
Well, my name's Kai, which is, of course, it's also Korean and Hawaiian and Chinese, but it is ultimately, the derivation is Norwegian. Half my family tree is Scandinavian, Norwegian, Minnesota.
Okay.
Half my family tree is German, New York. My parents met at college in Minnesota. But the big side of my family is the Norwegian, Scandinavian side, and my grandparents who lived closer to us were on that side of it, and it was always a big influence. And I went to a college that is Midwestern, Lutheran, heavily Scandinavian, and married a woman who was 100% Norwegian ancestry, whose name is Kirsten. And so when you had Kai and Kirsten, and you're thinking about names, we struggled. We couldn't agree about anything. I liked a bunch of names she didn't like, and vice versa, and we finally started just pouring through the alumni directory of our college, which was a lot of Scandinavian names, and came up with some there we could both agree on, and Tor was one of them.
Okay.
And then, so we, Kai and Kirsten have Tor, and then another one come along. You're not going to break the mold then and start naming your kid something that's not a kind of an unusual Scandinavian short name, and so Leif was
Leif.
Yeah.
Okay.
L-E-I-F. People say Leif, but it's Leif.
Have you guys actually gotten the chance to visit the region, to go to Scandinavia?
My wife has been there, and she and I traveled a lot when we were younger, before we had kids. We've been overseas a few times since, but not a lot. Overall, we've been to 49 states and 15 or 16 countries, and took some pretty long trips, 2.5 months in South America, things like that. But never went to Norway. She went when she was younger, and most of my family members have gone, and I plan to go. But when we were younger and traveling, we were also poor and traveling. So we would travel a long time, but we'd stay in hostels and camp out and hitchhike and things like that. We hitchhiked around Great Britain and Ireland for 6 weeks for our honeymoon, for example. So when you're traveling cheaply, some countries are better than others, and Norway is not cheap. And so ironically, even though I've been in quite a number of European countries and Asia and South America, I've not been to either Germany or Norway, but I'm looking forward to going to both.
Interesting. Do you have a favorite place that you visited?
We live in an amazing planet, on an amazing planet, and there's a lot of incredible places. Our most recent overseas trip was to Italy. Made me wonder how I hadn't been there earlier. We spent 3 weeks there a couple of years ago, and it was wonderful. And the history, the beauty, the people, culture is a remarkable experience. But I tend to be more drawn to the places that are destinations for us because of their ecosystems, their natural beauty. Alaska, Costa Rica were two of my favorite places. The Galapagos Islands was an amazing, unforgettable, once in a lifetime probably kind of experience. So those tend to be the ones that I, really enjoy the most. But there's a lot of great cities, amazing history, and we try to capture that as well.
Okay. And I have a few rapid fire questions for
Sure.
you as well, if you're ready.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, are you a dog person or a cat person?
I grew up with both. We have both. We have a rescue dog and we have two cats.
Okay. What are their names?
The dog is named Allie. She's part pit bull, part something else, a rescue, we don't know exactly, 45-pound sweetheart. And two cats, Kitty, not the most creative name, I know, but it just ended up that way, and Gwen, which is just short for Guinevere, which was the name that was given to her by the place where she was a rescue, and we could have changed it, but we didn't.
Okay. And are you a pie person or a cake person?
Oh, well, that depends on the pie or the cake, but if I had to pick one, I'd say pie. I wasn't expecting any questions like that. My wife makes really good pies.
Oh, really? Do you have a favorite pie?
No, not really. I mean, strawberry rhubarb
Okay.
is way up there.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
And I was also wondering if you could have dinner with 3 people,
Oh,
living
gosh.
or dead, who would you pick?
Living or dead. Oh my, I mean, I'm never even good when people post on Facebook and stuff like list your 10 favorite albums or your favorite book. I can never do that because it's so hard for me to break things down into favorites. I never think of things that way, even colors and all that stuff. But that's a really hard question. I mean, I think living or dead. I mean, I would love to talk to Charles Darwin. I've been to the Galapagos, having read Origin of Species, and I think just looking at a time when a person could have that kind of an impact and through things they could sort of figure out on their own through observation and what have you, I think that would be really, really interesting. If I had to pick, a political figure, I think, Abraham Lincoln, the complexity of his life, the drama and complexity of the times, the uniqueness of his just historical personality and impact, I think that would be particularly fascinating. I'd like to really meet Rachel Carson. I quote her all the time. She was a scientist, the author of Silent Spring, but she was more than a scientist and more than an author. She really had a sense of wonder, which is the name of one of her books, about nature and the environment that had a profound effect on me when I was reading a lot of those sorts of things in my early 20s that were transformative in some respects. And I would love to take a walk in the woods with her. I could name all sorts of other people, and those aren't really a top 3. I just tried to pick 3 quickly under pressure.
Okay, well, you don't like favorite questions, but then is there a book that has influenced you the most that you think?
Oh gosh, I mean, there are a lot of, let me answer a different way. In 1982, my New Year's resolution was to read 100 books about nature and the environment, from environmental politics to nature to natural sciences. And of course, in those days, we didn't have the internet. You'd go to a bookstore and they'd have small sections with this sort of thing. And I spent a lot of time at the beginning trying to pick the right things to read. Wendell Berry, Rachel Carson, Edward Abbey, just a lot of Charles Darwin, and contemporary things about water pollution, things like David Zwick and Ralph Nader and others. And I got to 70 some odd books in September, and I started working full time for an environmental organization. I never did get to 100 that year, but it was a big commitment, and I know that's like the opposite of answering your question, but the early books that I carefully chose and read through because I wanted to make sure I continued to do it and that I found it to be a worthwhile endeavor and a good positive experience, are still books I return to from time to time.
And what about movies?
Oh, geez. I mean, see, you're really making this hard for me.
Do you have desert island movies? Like 3 movies, if you could only watch 3 movies on a desert island.
Oh, gosh. I don't know if I could do that. I mean, I really probably can't do that. I do like films. I'm not the sort of person, though, who watches a favorite movie over and over again. There are probably a handful of movies I've seen a few times because I've rewatched them with other people, or it's been 10 or 20 years. You know, things like This Is Spinal Tap, or you know, or whatever that I'll watch again for some reason or another. But I really can't say that there's a favorite movie. I do like attending movies. I mean, my wife and I had 12 years of being married and living in the city before we had kids, and we used to go to a lot of films, offbeat films. One of the things that took a while to get used to living in Frederick was that there wasn't any place like that. You know, that if you wanted to go to a local movie, that meant the popular hits at the local movieplex or whatever, and we go to plenty of those, and I watch the Avengers movies and everything else like everybody else, you know, Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or whatever. But I really like, we've taken to going up to films at the Majestic in Gettysburg that change every week, and seeing some of the more offbeat or less popular, less well-known films there. And we enjoy that.
Okay. And what about your alcoholic drink of choice?
I mean, a good craft beer or a good red wine. It's funny, that during the 8 years we lived in California, I said, you know, we're moving to California, but I do not want to cultivate a taste for expensive wine.
You don't want to become a wine guy?
Well, I didn't want to become snobby about it or feel like I had to have an expensive. And in the end, what I learned is you can get a lot of perfectly good wine without spending very much money. And but I do like a good Cabernet from California, Argentina, Spain, Italy. You know, well, not a Cabernet if it's Italy, but you know what I mean. France. And that probably is my favorite drink of choice. But sometimes a good cold beer is the best thing.
Okay. Do you have a favorite brewery in Frederick?
You can ask me to pick between local breweries.
Yeah.
I do like a number of the Flying Dog beers, and I found that they do versions of some beers that I may not even care for a lot at other times, like their Blood Orange Ale or something, that I really like it when they do it. So I guess that would be an answer. I'm not trying to pick favorites.
Well, I'm also going to ask you, do you have a favorite restaurant in Frederick?
There are a lot of great restaurants in Frederick. A recent discovery that I really like and have been to a number of times, and I wish it was downtown instead, but it's out by the Westview, is Maida's. It's a Peruvian restaurant. It's small, but it's wonderful. I mean, the service is incredible. The food is fantastic. The preparation is beautiful. They're very friendly, and I want people to go there so it stays in business, even though it's a little off the beaten path. They've recently started a food truck, and they do some catering. But you know, there's so many restaurants downtown. I mean, Sumitra and others that are just great. But the one we've gone to the most, because it's with a large family group and because both our boys really liked it, was Cacique.
Oh, okay.
So.
And I have been asking people to give me facts about themselves that they don't think their constituents would know. And do you have any facts about yourself that?
What sort of facts?
Well, I think that it's too broad and people are really struggling with it. So I was going to change it and ask if you had 3 unfulfilled items on your bucket list that you really want to fill.
Well, I would say one of them for sure would be related to traveling. I mean, there's a lot of places I'd like to go, and you know, I'm 60 now, and I realize I'm not going to get to go to all of them. And mixing that with some of my favorite places that I would like to go back to is hard. But you know, Australia, Hawaii, it's the only state I haven't been in. So that's one thing on my bucket list, would be being physically able to get around and enjoy myself to a ripe old age, and get in a fair amount of traveling later. Other things on my bucket list, I mean, my wife would kill me if I ever did it, but I always wanted a parachute.
Okay.
I have not done it. I have friends that have, and I would like to do that. I know George H.W. Bush did it when he was in his, I think, 70s, and you know, maybe in his memory I could reconsider, but I haven't ever done that, and it gets less and less likely as I get older. But that's one thing. And an odd one, I guess, would be I don't know if I'll ever do it. It's going to be also one of those things that gets less and less likely and harder as I get older. But I always thought it'd be really cool to walk the whole Appalachian Trail in just one or two, maybe over a 2-year period. But I think that would be a really wonderful experience.
Okay.
But my bucket list is way too long, unfortunately.
Well, Kai, thank you so much for coming in and speaking with us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.